Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're here to celebrate the release of Carlos Motta, History's Backrooms, a 20-year monograph of Carlos's work, which was recently published by Skira. I'm Roya Amirsoleymani, Artistic Director and Curator of Public Engagement at Portland Institute for Contemporary Art, or what's called PICA, where Carlos's current exhibition, We Got Each Other's Back,
thank you for
which is in collaboration.
We're here to celebrate the release of Carlos Motta, History's Back.
Sorry about that. In collaboration with Elday de la Cruz, Julio Salgado, and Edna Vasquez, opened November 7th and is on view until February 14th. Located in what is called Portland, Oregon, PICA is situated on the unceded and occupied lands of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cathlamet, Cowlitz, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other indigenous peoples. Please join us in extending gratitude and respect to the Indigenous elders past, present, and future, whose lands we are on now. This panel is presented in partnership with P.P.O.W Gallery in New York. Thank you to Trey Hollis and everyone at P.P.O.W for their collaboration, and to all the PICA staff who have supported this event, especially Leslie Vigent, who's running our slideshows today, Mallory Wilson, Chris Balow, and to my colleague, Kristen Kennedy, who co-curated Carlos's exhibition at PICA with me. In turn, many thanks to Skira, the publisher of History's Backrooms, which is distributed in the US by Artbook and can be purchased online at pica.org, at skira.net, and through the Bureau of General Services Queer Division, an all-volunteer queer cultural center and bookstore. Relatedly, regarding purchases and money, just so you know, any donations that were made today and registering for this event will be shared evenly among PICA, Pueblo Unido, and VO's Workers' Rights Education Project, the latter two beneficiaries providing direct resources as grassroots organizations serving undocumented communities and advocating for migrant justice in Portland. And along with Carlos today, we're joined by some very special guests, all of them curators who've worked closely with Carlos, and some of whom contributed essays to the book. Miguel A. López, co-director and chief curator of Teorética in San Jose, Costa Rica. Hendrik Folkerts, Dittmer curator of contemporary art at the Art Institute of Chicago. And Eungie Joo, curator of contemporary art at San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. I wish we could all be together in person, but I'm thrilled that we're able to gather virtually in this way and celebrate not just the book, but Carlos himself and his work of the last nearly 2 decades, including the current exhibition at PICA. I'd like to turn it over to Carlos to talk a bit about how this book came together. That's really why we're here today. And then we can get started with presentations and panel discussion. So Carlos, I'll let you say a few words, please.
Thank you, Roya, and thank you everyone for tuning in and coming together with us today to hear about the book that was published just before the pandemic became very serious and sat in a storage unit in Milan for about 6 months or so. So it really hasn't had a chance to see the light of day in the way that anyone would have liked the book to be presented. But I'm very thankful to you and Kristen and Trey and Wendy and Penny and Ella at P.P.O.W Gallery and everyone else there for coming together to present this book, as I am to More Charpentier Gallery in Paris, Galería Vermelho in São Paulo, and Galería Filomena Soares, all of which came together to make the project come to be. I'm especially excited today to have a chance to converse and present some of the work that is present in the book with Miguel, Hendrik, and Eungie, all of which I have worked in several occasions in different capacities, and who I think have a great knowledge of the work that I have produced. As well as Kristen and Roya, who I have been working with for the past 2 years in presenting the exhibition We Got Each Other's Back, which is the photograph I have behind me, and it's now on view at PICA. I also want to thank Julio Salgado, Edna Vasquez, and Elday de la Cruz, who are my collaborators and subjects of the work that we are presenting in the exhibition. Very briefly, I want to mention the way that this book project came together. which is a kind of dream accomplishment for me as an artist. It is the first monograph of my work after working for close to 20 years. And it was something that I was kind of waiting for a phone call to appear one day. And that phone call happened. And Eduardo Guizzoni, who manages the international publications at Skira, called me up one morning and he said, I've been following your work. I would be interested in working on a project with you. So I embarked on this really interesting and intense experience of sort of like going through the archive, understanding everything that I had done, including projects, publications, public programs, all the writing that I have done along with the works. And then had a chance to sort of like design the book in collaboration with Eduardo and the team at Skira, both conceptually, but also aesthetically. So the book is as chronological. It starts in 1996 with some self-portraits I did at the age of 18. And it ends actually with the work that is now on view at PICA. We got each other's back. It also includes texts that I have written, as well as excerpts and texts that other people have written about the work and have been either published in exhibition catalogs or magazines and different kinds of publications. And lastly, there is, but perhaps most importantly, I had a chance to commission 5 texts for the publication. Miguel, who's here with us today, is the text that sort of like shows a kind of diagonal view of all the work that I have done. So it's a kind of introductory text. Hendrik is writing about the work that I did in a long cycle of projects called the Democracy Cycle, which includes mostly documentary-based and socially based social practice projects. Andrea Junta, curator and art historian from Argentina, is writing about the works that I have done dealing with sexual and gender minorities throughout the colonial years after the conquest in the Americas, which is a more sculptural and film-based practice. Agustin Perez Rubio did an in-depth interview with me, which was really a treat to work on, as anything with Agustin, that also reviews all of the work. And lastly, Victor Manuel Rodriguez, who is an art historian and curator and artist from Colombia, wrote a preface for the book. So I want to thank all of you so much for writing the text, and Eungie Joo, who did not write a text, but with whom I've worked a few times, and I love you very much. Thank you all for being here. And I want to hand it over to Roya again for the conversation.
Great, thank you, Carlos. So a few things before we dive into presentations. In terms of the structure and kind of flow for today, we're going to go until about 5:30 p.m. Pacific time or 8:30 p.m. Eastern time. Each panelist has prepared a brief 5 or so minute presentation about a particular project or body of work by Carlos, one they've written about or that they've worked with him on closely. And then they'll pose a question to Carlos or the whole group, the whole panel, for about 7 or so minutes of discussion, at which point we'll then move to the next presentation. So we're interspersing the conversation among the presentations to keep things more dynamic. I'll be lightly moderating and presenting briefly toward the end, and we'll be sharing a slideshow of images that are selected by each panelist. So there will be times that you're just seeing the slideshow and the current speaker. And about 15 minutes or so before the end of our time together, we'll take questions from the audience. If you'd like to pose a question, you're going to want to type it into the chat bar in your viewing platform, Eventive, which is on the left side, or sorry, on the right side. So you're going to type in your question, and then we have some staff from PICA fielding those questions over to us, and then we'll answer what we have time for. And you are welcome to ask a question in the moment that you have it, but we may not be able to get to it right then, or we may save it until the end. But we'll get to everything that we can. And then finally, this panel is being recorded, and it will be available to view through the close of the exhibition at PICA in mid-February. So please tell other people who might not have been able to make it. Okay, that's enough for me. I'm excited to turn things over. Miguel A. López is our first presenter, and will be followed by Hendrik, and then Eungie, and then myself, and all of you. And Carlos will be in dialogue with us throughout, and we'll have conversation between each presentation. So Miguel, I'd love to turn things over to you.
Hi. Well, thanks for this lovely invitation, Roya, Carlos, Trey, Kristen. It is a real pleasure to be part of this book launch and conversation, also with dear friends and colleagues. Yes, well, I know Carlos for almost a decade. We started to talk around 2010. I think Carlos received in New York a printed copy of a magazine, I guess edited in Buenos Aires, an issue of Ramona magazine dedicated to trans feminists and queer art practice in Latin America. And after that, we have started a very rich dialogue and exchange. And through these years, we worked together in several projects, as Carlos mentioned, and I'm truly happy of being part of this powerful book that is an invitation to explore, but also to celebrate Carlos' committed, brilliant artistic practice. So yesterday I was thinking, next slide, please. I was thinking, why did I feel this connection with his work since the beginning? And in 2010, at the time we started to talk, Carlos was working on a project called 6 Acts, an experiment in narrative justice that consisted of a series of performative actions in public squares in Bogota, Colombia. I remember that that project made me think a lot about the various meanings of justice. For me, that I born in Peru in the middle of an extremely violent armed conflict in the early 1980s, thinking about restorative justice and the access to it was and still is very important. In my text for the book, I talk about this work, but I wanted to bring this piece into the conversation because I feel that this specific project marked Carlos' transition into the exploration of the role that gender and sexual politics have played in historical narratives. Next slide, please. In this project, 6 actors of different social and ethnic backgrounds read speeches by 6 Colombian liberal and left-wing presidential candidates who were assassinated because of their political positions. But an important aspect of the piece is the presence of 3 female actors who antagonize society's male-dominated institutions. Next slide, please. And I would like to quote Carlos here from a conversation with curator Gabriela Rangel from 2010. Talking about this work, Carlos said, I quote, "My desire was to symbolically queer the speeches and by extension, public space, ideologies, and institutions. By doing so, the text would inevitably feel differently," end of quote. So 6 Acts was, in a way, the spark for the archival project, We Who Feel Differently, that he developed 1 year later and that was exhibited with Eungie at the museum in 2012. But what interests me to think and bring into the conversation here is that this transition into gender and sexual politics is actually a return. Next slide, please. And why do I say return? Between 1996 and 2000, Carlos produced a very powerful series of photographs and drawings that he didn't show until very recently. And yes, I think Carlos were about 18 or 19, 20 years old, right? So in these early works, the artist explores his own sexual identity and emotional structures. Next slide, please. One of them is the Untitled Self-Portrait series from 1998, where Motta performed characters for the camera, characters that embrace the malleability of the body and its gender markers, using self-fashioning and makeup to evoke sensations that oscillate between eroticism, anger, abjection, and mourning. Next slide, please. As I say in the book, in my view, these early works are a remarkably premature, intuitive, and powerful investigation of the notion of social rights in relation to queer desire acknowledging forms of existence that defy patriarchal and heteronormative values. And I think it's very revealing that Carlos would not use his own body again in his work until very recently. Next slide. I think this is the last one. Yeah. So these early self-portraits anticipate his interest in the politics of exclusion that organize social norms, the categorization of some bodies as non-persons, and the struggles for self-determination and self-representation. So Carlos, I wanted to start with two questions for you. Well, the first is if you actually see 6 acts, this project I mentioned, as a transitional piece into queer and gender politics in your recent production. And the second question, what it meant for you to dive into your old negatives and sketchbooks and bring some of these materials from the perspective of the present, this material from the 80s. And I also am asking you this because I think it's not by chance that the photo that you choose for the cover of the book is actually a photograph from 1996. Yes.
Thank you, Miguel. Yes, I think you are spot on in both suggested questions, but there is actually an earlier moment in a project called The Good Life where I was traveling around Latin America interviewing passerbys on how they perceived democracy locally and in relationship to US interventions. And in one of those moments in Tegucigalpa in Honduras, I had a conversation with a street vendor. His name was Andres Cruz Vasquez. And I asked Andres Cruz Vasquez, what is your perception of democracy? And he said, for democracy, there must be love. For democracy, there must be affection. For democracy, there must be a sustained relationship between humans. So far, I was working in a very kind of strict documentary way, inspired by the great heterosexual male documentary filmmakers of the past, right? Especially thinking about third cinema in Argentina, etc. And I went back home, and so this answer by Andres Cruz Vasquez kind of threw me off, because I started to think like, but wait, what about political structures of power? What about oppression? What about class? What about race? And I sat with that for a long time, and I started to understand that actually the interesting thing about the political as it manifested had to be how it constructed subjectivity and affects, right? So I kept that in mind as I continued working. I, maybe 2 years later, started the project that you referenced, 6 Acts, an experiment in narrative justice, which is citing speeches delivered by presidential candidates, all of which also were male, and who had been killed because of their political ideologies. But as I was reading this text, I wanted to reperform them not in character. It wasn't interesting to me to have someone perform the role of Jaime Pardo Leal or Luis Carlos Galán as they, it wasn't an acting role. It was really a way of channeling subjectivity and the ways in which political speech defines the ways in which we live our lives, right, in relationship to what happens in the political with a capital P, if you wish. So the idea of bringing intergenerational and women to perform was essential. It was about, understanding Colombian citizenship in its fullest. So there is also, one of the actors is an indigenous woman from the north of Colombia. So we are, the idea was really to sort of like start to think about what are sort of like the boundaries or the intersections of the political as we perceive it from the outside, and how it actually manifests in our bodies and in our minds. So that for the first one. For the second one, because I had embarked on a pretty strict educational journey. I had a lot to prove for myself in terms of going to school, developing a keen interest in conceptual art, not defining myself as a kind of medium specific artist, attending the Whitney Museum Independent Study Program and really understanding sort of like the role of Marxism and gender theory and queer theory in relationship to my work. A lot of my really early work, the first 12 or so years, is dry, strict, in a way, normatively left-leaning. And I forgot that there was an intuitive artist that was expressive and sort of like that had done other things before. So when I was preparing my first exhibition at P.P.O.W gallery, indeed, I remembered these photographs I had taken when I was still living in Colombia, which are some taken at my father's house. And I went back, found the negatives, and was really shocked, kind of shaken by what I, or shook, whatever tense that is, by what I found, because I found an artist who was not an intellectual artist. He was someone who was making work from the gut, right? He was not, even though there are some clear sort of like aesthetic references in those photographs, I was keenly interested in Buto, which I think is obvious in the sense, in the way that I had painted my body and the kinds of movements I am performing, but it wasn't intellectual work. It was really work that I did in light of my mother's untimely passing and things like that. So it became very important for me to sort of like show that work, insert it into this larger arch of work that I had been producing. And it also gave me permission to start working that way again, right? So since I have returned to performing, returned to using my own body, and sort of like relaxed those things that I kind of had to prove to myself. Like I don't feel, you know, I'm an older person now, so I don't really need to sort of like live by that word. And that's, in that sense, this work was really kind of liberatory and gave me permission to do the things that I'm doing now.
May I just, I don't know, yeah, I just wanted to add, like, kind of looking at those works from the late 90s, and hi everyone, by the way, I was always so struck with sort of the sincerity in them and sort of the affect in them. They really had a very strong sort of effect on me when I first saw them. But indeed, like, as you say, I think it's so fascinating to look at sort of the long arc of things, right? And I see sort of in the late 90s, especially in the series of Untitled photographs, you know, an artist of like sort of self-exploration, like researching sort of masquerade and different sort of expressions of the body. And then, you know, after the time when you were going into more sort of an intellectual route, if you will, so much of your work becomes around sort of relationality, right? Sort of acknowledging that you and your body and whatever you like represent is part of a larger structure, part of larger and sort of multitude of like different communities. And the work very much sort of becomes about that. And I'm so fascinated if you could talk a little bit more actually about kind of, you know, revisiting those works where your own body, let's say, and your own sort of figure is more central to the work after such a long time of thinking about things sort of in relationship to something. You're still muted. Yeah.
Thank you, Hendrik, for that question. That's an interesting question because, you know, when you are working in a kind of documentary way, right? When you are, you know, like The Good Life took about 2 years to complete, and it was a project where I walked literally all of these cities, 12 cities, with an assistant. It was also very performative work, right? It was a work that demanded engaging, prompting questions, learning how to interview, right? Learning how to speak. I was keenly interested at the time in this idea of public opinion, like how is public opinion constructed through the interaction with an interviewer, a newscaster, somebody who's filming. So like all of those things were like put me really in the role of it was a performative aspect of creating the work. Most often, though, I chose to remove myself in the editing, which is a common strategy to documentary practice, right? So you have head stalking, people speaking, relationships that are forged on film, but are not necessarily, the relationship is not necessarily structured that way. where I am present. So, but that already, I think, was you know, a very physically taxing practice, and it always came from the first person. Like I wanted to, you know, engage with these narratives, the construction of these narratives, not make them seem objective or truthful or real. So there was, my voice was always there somehow. I think with the works that I'm doing more recently, which actually are have kind of like given me license to think about durational performance and that are physically demanding, in the sense that I maybe, you know, suspended from my feet, or suspended by bondage, or, you know, performing a task of speaking with a mouth gag and things like that in works that I've done, have to do, I think, with wanting to really reveal the ways in which some of these stories that I'm telling have scarred me personally. So they have to do, they're more biographical in a sense. They have to do with also realizing that I am implicated in these stories. I'm not only someone who's engaging in a conversation to represent somebody else's stories, but oftentimes the subjects that I deal with are subjects that I have dealt with myself. And so this is a way for me to put myself literally in the work, like actually my body is there, but also to speak about how, you know, all of these things are things that I've been thinking about and have scarred me and have left a mark on my body and my psyche.
Carlos, I wanted to say that for me also, having been exposed to your work, maybe during the democracy cycle, with this kind of distance that you're describing now, you know, like kind of rules and like an objective distance from which you cannot produce the objective voice. It was very surprising to see those photographs in the P.P.O.W show, and I think that it is really remarkable, your restraint, even if it was like an accident or something forgotten or something kind of buried, to resurface those images when you did, because I think it was a surprisingly vulnerable thing, you know, to go back to, of course, the passing of your mother, and, you know, what kinds of like complex emotional elements are involved in late adolescence anyway, you know? So, you know, so I think like to be exposed also to your way of thinking and this kind of very sincere and authentic, kind of restricted way of thinking about yourself as a political being before you knew that it was political being, that you were a political being, is really interesting and it allows us to go backwards and forwards through your work to look at things, I think, in an interesting way, you know, to find how, or to inform something that we thought we understood differently, you know, at the point that we're exposed to this kind of vulnerability. It's fascinating to me, and so interesting how your work was able to move from that point.
Thank you, Eungie. I mean, one thing, are we still on time for this session, Roya? Can I respond?
If you want to take a minute to respond, we're okay.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, because I think the reason I decided to include these photographs in that show was called Desires, and it was really looking at, it was sort of like the early work that I had been doing on colonial sexualities and the ways in which bodies and gender identities were constructed by this kind of colonial framework in the Americas, looking at archival cases, or literally taken out of criminal cases from the archives. And what became really apparent in all of those things was the construction of the deviant, or the so-called hermaphrodite, the sodomite, all of these pejorative descriptions of sexual and gender difference, was that that figure became a monster. It was a monster that was the label monster and the representation of monster was put on us, on those who live differently, so to speak. And when I found these photographs, I was literally performing monstrosity, right? I was performing all of these things. So the relationship between that, the film The Sales, or the piece Towards a Homoerotic Historiography, which depicts the bodies of pre-Hispanic indigenous groups engaged in homoerotic sex. Like it was a really interesting conversation. It was a conversation about alterity and monstrosity and difference in a way that I feel made the show more complex for me, and again implicated me in owning the label of monster and what to do with it.
Thank you, everyone. I think we'll move to Hendrik now, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you so much. And thank you as well for having us here and celebrating the launch of this amazing book, which has been on my bed for the past week, going through it again. Carlos and I, maybe that's a good place to start. I feel like we've been in conversation off and on for the majority of sort of a decade now. So it's very much one of the longer term sort of conversations with an artist in my life. And I'm extremely grateful for that. Most recently, the Art Institute where I work has also sort of acquired his work, of course. And my sort of involvement with the book was a very welcome sort of invitation to kind of, go back to certain works that I did know, but to kind of, like see them really as part of a larger cycle. And that brings me to the next slide, because my essay focused on the democracy cycle, the arc of which in the essay I discussed between 2008 and 2019, but I want to sort of emphasize this is very much an ongoing sort of body of work. So it was just these sort of 12 years that I was able to sort of cover in the essays. The democracy cycle is a series of ongoing video performance and installation work that started in 2008. And in the series, you investigate, but also really, I would say, sort of probe and sort of challenge who is represented in existing democratic sort of models, and more importantly, who is actually not, especially pertaining to LGBTQI+ and migrant communities. So a lot of the people that you have built sort of relationships with over the years feature in the respective works, and they center very much on sort of LGBTQI+ and feminist movements, anti-nationalism, anti-fascism, anti-racism, often within sort of a politics of migration and displacement. In the works that are part of the series, a number of which I sort of will come back to, but a lot of them that are sort of part of the essay, use different artistic sort of approaches, ranging from sort of a documentary film approach, and sort of the direct address, where you, as you already said, kind of put yourself out of it and actually let the person speak who you're at that moment sort of engaging with. But also a really fascinating point that I'm sort of interested to speak a little bit more on later, the exploration and the establishment of different sort of archives in various ways. We can go to the next slide, because I want to go through a couple of examples just really briefly. The Crossing, one of the most recent iterations of the democracy cycle from 2017. The work premiered in Amsterdam as an installation comprising 11 video channels, featuring the very moving, actually, and harrowing stories of recent immigrants to the Netherlands, sort of predominantly from North Africa and the Middle East. So these 11 video channels, which you kind of see a couple of them on the left image here, were each sort of featuring one single sort of individual, and they were displayed sort of together in a room alongside a presentation of over 30 objects from various sort of Dutch museum collections. For instance, from the Rijksmuseum, the Amsterdam Historical Museum, and the World Cultures Institute. Sort of objects that I want to say really sort of complicate the long sustained myth of Dutch sort of openness, if you will, by really sort of pointing to and illustrating a long history of anti-migration sort of stances, colonization, xenophobia, and sort of nationalism in the recent history of Holland too. And one of the most sort of compelling aspects of the work, I would say, is exactly that kind of like juxtaposition. So on the one hand, between putting these sort of let's say objects and the institution behind them sort of on display, sort of exposing them in a way as well. And then kind of these sort of 11 channels really kind of sort of bringing these sort of stories to a contemporary moment and sort of indirect relationship to the sort of objects that we see. And what I'm interested in is kind of also looking at this body of work as a new form of institutional critique, to really think about how the institutions that, you know, that you sort of show your work in, but that we all sort of work for or have sort of a function in as well, kind of, you know, form an institutional sort of archive to which history is sort of acknowledged, ignored, shifted, revised, whatever kind of approach you would take. Next slide, please. I'm going to hurry up a little bit because I talk too much. This is a work from 2015. Patriots, Citizens, and Lovers. Again, an 11-channel video, which for me, one of the most sort of defining aspects of this work is its like physicality. Like you would stand in this room and there's sort of these sort of bodies, they really kind of speak to you. And the bodies in question are a number of LGBTQI and feminist activists living in the Ukraine during the time of the most recent Russian sort of intervention, let's say around that time. And it really revolves around the, sort of the experiences of, but also very succinctly the speech of. Actually, there's a lot of like speech acts that are really like visceral, I think, in this work, of people sort of operating from within sort of marginalized communities, within a very sort of masculinist and quite sort of oppressive at times society. So yeah, just want to sort of highlight the human scale, and again, sort of form of sort of documentary direct address that kind of, yeah, was felt sometimes very like differently than how he did it in other works. Next slide. I would be remiss, of course, not to also point out something that thankfully has already been mentioned, but that one of the recent sort of works in the cycle is now on view at the Portland Institute of Contemporary Art, which is We Got Each Other's Back, which you made in sort of a collaboration with Helder de la Cruz, Julio Salgado, and Edna Vasquez. And this is really, this is a multi-channel video installation as well. There's some sort of images from that here that features sort of video portraits, if you will, of queer artists and activists in the United States who are or have been openly undocumented and who are working to fight sort of historic and sort of contemporary unjust immigration policies in the US. So these three works kind of point to different aspects that I want to sort of talk a bit about in the cycle at large. And for me, kind of an opening to the cycle is also to talk about the notion of solidarity and how that kind of has formed in your work over time. And I think we've made such a wonderful start at the beginning of this sort of discussion to talk about sort of the arc of your work and how after sort of the ISP and sort of your time in New York, I felt that your work really kind of opened up and sort of acknowledged your own sort of experiences sort of in relationship to other communities, but also the ones that you're sort of a part of yourself. So solidarity comes up as sort of a notion that I feel has sort of deeply informed your work and sort of continues definitely sort of the works in this sort of a specific cycle. So I just want you to sort of invite you to talk a little bit more about that word, how it is featured in your work, but also your practice, And perhaps this is also a segue, because in the book, it actually features a lot of your own sort of hiding as well, to maybe kind of sort of draw it into that, how sort of writing has become a way to sort of, kind of give voice, kind of give a different sort of voice to that kind of solidarity too.
Thank you, Hendrik. Yeah, I mean, that's a big point and a big question that I've been grappling with throughout the making of works on many ways. There is the question of what does it mean to represent someone else, right? To engage with a community and set up a project in motion that deals with the experiences of others. And I've always wanted to kind of flat on resist that notion as an objective notion. And I always understand that what people encounter in the work is a relationship, it's a subjective relationship between people. And I've always wanted to foreground again the ways in which these kinds of relationships need to be collaborative in order to mean something. I think the project that is now at PICA, We Got Each Other's Back, is a good example of this work. It is not work that is of my authorship, it's of the authorship of those people who I collaborated with, Julio, Eldai, and Edna. It is born out of a conversation about what it means for them to engage with me, right? What is at stake in a process like this and in a project like this for everyone involved, and also to develop an ethics of relationship in terms of how do you produce a work? So there are many things that happen in a project, like for example, who is involved in the production, who shoots, who is the sound person, etc. That oftentimes the public doesn't see, but I think are very much a part of building relationships. And in the case of this project, for example, it was very important that the people we were working with were part of the communities that were being spoken for or about in the work. So I think that the notion of solidarity is less of a representational politics situation for me, and it's more of an actual engagement with people on their own terms. And also an acknowledging of positionalities. Who am I? Where is the work presented? What does it mean for me to present work of my authorship in an institution? What does it mean for the person whose work is presented in the institution under the rubric of being the subject of a work? So I feel like I'm not gonna answer those questions because I think it's an interesting challenge for people to think about, right? But these are the things that I'm constantly talking about with the people that I work with. In the case of the project in the Netherlands at the Stedelijk Museum, The Crossing, it was a similar process. It was really thinking about, in collaboration with Secret Garden, who is an organization that assists migrants as they are seeking asylum upon arrival in the Netherlands, especially LGBT migrants. So the conversation was with both the leading people of the organization and also the people who ended up being in the project. Like, what does it mean for them to have the platform of a mainstream contemporary art museum like the Stedelijk and speak to that audience, right? So it didn't happen to be the Stedelijk Museum. The project is built around speaking to the public that comes to the Stedelijk Museum. And in the project that Eungie and I presented, which is the first chapter at MoMA, the work that is made by with Julio Salgado, it was a bit of the same conversation. What does it mean for Julio's work to be presented in this very prominent way at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, being the first time that Julio's work was presented there? So for Julio's work to have this, again, mainstream platform to speak to an audience that maybe doesn't have access to the networks that he was using or he uses to present his work. Even though Julio is an artist with a big career in and of itself, that was not a venue he had been a part of. So I think it is a question, if I like to call it, as I said earlier, a kind of ethics of relationship and ethics of production that I think establishes the notion of solidarity. And I'm just gonna say this once more because I think it's important for me to say it again, which is, for me, solidarity is not about representation. It's not about optics, right? It is about actually working together and about creating a system where the work then will present itself in that way. And I just say that because I oftentimes encounter work that it is about solidarity, but you don't really understand if the process is really a process of solidarity, so to speak.
It's one of the reasons why I wanted to highlight the word, because so many of the works in the democracy cycle are about the effective failure of sort of the representational model of democracy, which unfolded at the time, you know, whether it's like 2008 or 2015 in Europe or the States, or sort of in many parts of the world, where we saw the failure of that model unfold in a spectacular way sometimes, right? And certainly this year has been quite the year in that regard as well in the States, to kind of see kind of forms of sort of democracy that you actively critique, actually still kind of faltering in sort of the public sphere. And that's why I wanted to point to sort of solidarity indeed as a process that I feel is very sort of underpins a lot of sort of the activities that we see in your work, but also kind of, yeah, behind the screens, so to speak. Before I move on to the next question, maybe just kind of like, if the others have like responses or things they'd like to share. Normally we'd be sitting in a table, it would be a little bit more informal, but.
In the interest of time, you might want to jump to the next question, Hendrik.
Aye. I want to talk about archives, and that's again a massive sort of question, and more an invitation for people who are listening to buy this book and read a lot about your work, right? If they don't know it already. But the archive in so many ways features in your work, you know, whether it's, you know, work outside of the cycle, like you already mentioned, sort of towards a homoerotic historiography, which really kind of revisits sort of a, let's say, sort of a collection of object, kind of like bringing them or reframing them in a very different way than they were sort of displayed before, but also in the democracy cycle. And the crossing is again a very interesting example, I think. There's two archival forms at play for me. There's the one, this kind of display of, let's say, recent history or sort of historical objects from these various Dutch sort of museum collections, which is a re-engagement with it. They're being reframed in that space, of course, in sort of according to the work that we see on the other side of the room, which is this sort of 11 video channels, which for me become a living archive, a kind of an unfolding archive. And so I'm interested to unpack this notion of the archive a little bit more. There's two ways to approach this. I could just ask you, okay, how have you kind of navigated these different like sort of relationships to the archive? But I'm also interested to talk about the book actually in that sense, which becomes an archival forms in itself. So perhaps how the book became a vehicle as well for you to think about the archive in relationship to your own work, in fact.
Sure. Thank you for that, Hendrik. Yeah, I mean, the archive is something I've been thinking about from the beginning of my work. Initially, I was interested in, or I think I understand early on that there was an imminent need to construct alternative histories, because I never found myself represented or the concerns that I cared about represented in mainstream narratives and mainstream archives. So I felt from the beginning with a work like The Good Life or a work like Gender Talents or We Who Feel Differently, that I wanted to construct these archives of oral histories that would tell the engagement of people with political subjects in a different way, that were not mediated by the dominant narratives of our time, so to speak. In The Good Life, for example, or another work called Brief History, it has to do with US interventions in Latin America and the kind of like porous and really complicated ways in which the American interventions are a part of all of the continent's daily life. right? Economically, culturally, socially, historically, militarily, etc. And I wanted to see how those things play out. You know, how much knowledge do we have, and what do people think about these things in relationship to how they go about their business, and how, both from an untrained perspective, a pedestrian, but also for someone who like works as a human rights lawyer or as an academic, and so to speak. So there is that element of wanting to construct these web archives. I've done 3 web archives so far. And the idea is that, you know, there would be a different framework to approach these stories. Then the second one has to do with an even more perverse one, which has to do with the colonial archive and the ways in which, as I was saying earlier, there are certain lives that are absolutely defined and that we only have access to through historical representation in an archive. The life of the sodomite, right? Nobody cared about the life of a sodomite that didn't get caught, but the minute they get caught, this sodomite is the subject of a case, and it's the only way that we know about sodomy. So that the idea that we need to intervene that archive, change the narrative, fictionalize it, take the liberties to understand that there are certain lives that are unfairly only defined by an interaction with legality or morality or these patriarchal mainstream institutions. So to me, that engagement with the archive is actually one that is very rich, because it allows me to look at the ways in which there needs to be a different enunciation of a history and allow for a different way of understanding lives lived. Then there is the question of the other archive that you have access to, which is, for example, the one that I used for The Crossing, the museum collection. And one of the things that I'm interested in is understanding how those aesthetic archives are also so important in defining a colonized, or how they played a colonizing role and define a colonized mind. The ways in which we engage an exhibition, the aesthetics of display, all of these things are also ways of colonizing knowledge. So something presented in a certain way is maybe more respectable, and you would engage it in certain ways without necessarily questioning what it means. An encyclopedic museum like the Stedelijk Museum uses a certain kind of aesthetics of display that I think need to be dismantled to understand Dutch colonization elsewhere and at home. So that is another form of engagement with the archive. And the last one is the one in the book. I think is interesting because it is a fairly conventional book in the way that it was constructed, right? It's not an experimental book. It's not an artist project. It's sort of like a chronological monograph. But I did want to have that book. I wanted to be able to kind of provide an A to C sort of chronological view of the work, so that people could engage with the progression and see the evolution, but also the contradictions and the things that are good and the ones that are not so good. Like there was editing, but there were also things that I'm not so keen of, but they're still there because it was important to me to kind of leave that. As far as I'm concerned, this is the only book I will ever have, right? So that in that sense, you know, I wanted it to be, I wanted to be there. I wanted everything to be included in that kind of archive.
Thank you, Carlos.
Can I have 1 minute to ask something related to this archival-based methodology that Hendrik mentioned? Something that I wasn't aware of until I actually started to write the essay for the book is that, Carlos, you in 2002, more or less, were employing net art and interactive digital art, new media, right? And I'm thinking specifically in the webzine artworld.org, which you edited from 2002 and 2008, if I'm not wrong, no, right? I'm building this archive of critical interactions between different cultural actors, activists, artists, thinkers. And I wanted to ask you about these projects because I think they were thinking and exploring the impact of communication and technology on contemporary arts. I mean, almost 20 years ago. and especially thinking in what ways digital realities are encouraging or were encouraging at that time new forms of politicized arts, which is really interesting to think right now in the face of the crucial role that the internet and social media has in massive social demonstrations and protests around the world. Yeah.
Thank you, Miguel. Yeah, so Artworld, artwurl.org. It was an art world. It was a pun on the word Artworld, but URL is a project and a name that I inherited. It was never like my favorite name, but I was invited to, it was a project that was started by PS122 Gallery in this village. And I was invited to take it on because the editor, Calvin, at the time was leaving it. So I took it on and I really saw it as an opportunity to speak about this new field of new genres, of new media that was so strong at the moment. I mean, everything was about net art at the turn of the century and at the first couple of years of the new century. So the idea was really to create an archive of critical and political art. So I sort of like started to reach out to my networks, you know, artists like Andrea Geyer and Sharon Hayes, Carla Herrera Prats. I commissioned interviews between artists. I was interested in having artists speak and kind of like present concerns. There were artist projects as well. But we also had access to PS122 Gallery, which is a small gallery in this village. So we also managed to do public programs and exhibitions related to that project. As sort of like the internet became more, you know, widely used, and many platforms started to be created in that space, I think the relevancy of that project started to fade. In fact, I learned this year that the whole website was done using Flash script, right? And Flash is running, like it will not be runnable anymore at all as of the end of this year. So the life of Artworld is gone forever. Like nobody will access this. I could have, you know, engaged in trying to save it and change and use a different scripting language, but we, you know, decided to sort of like let it go. So it really encapsulates a period of time that was determined by Adobe Acrobat Flash, and it's gone. It will be gone.
Okay, thank you, Hendrik and Carlos and Miguel for your question. I think we should move on to Eungie.
Super. Thank you, guys. Thanks so much, Roya and Carlos, for inviting me today to participate in this talk. Speaking of your former work with the art world, is a great segue, actually, because that's about the time that we met. Because, in fact, we met, I think, through the artist Paul Chan, or maybe even my brother, Michael Joo, because of your graduate school work at Bard and their knowledge of you through that, and we were destined to meet, you know, because whoever introduced us knew that we would share some ideas, but we really got to know each other's thinking through participation in Anton Vidokli's Night School project at the New Museum, which was one of the first major public programs of the newly reopened New Museum on the Bowery. So that was around 2008, I believe. And it has been an incredible opportunity, you know, to accompany you during this time with regards to the development of your work and its kind of greater public, our greater public access to your way of thinking, which has really moved me. I wanted to, could we have the first slide, to introduce our initial project that we were able to do together at the New Museum. It actually opened in 2012, but I was remembering that the way I knew about this project was in fact because you came to me to ask me if I had any contacts in Korea when you first got the grant from the Norwegian government to execute this project. And And I remembered that at that time, you know, just to think about the history of LGBTQI plus activism and knowledge in Asia, you know, at the time we had a lot of difficulty accessing artists who would be willing to speak with you, or even activists. And it's you know, it's a big difference to today, even 12 years later or 15 years later than what it was at the time. So it's many things I thought about in these last days. But I wanted to just say that this project, the Museum is Hub, Carlos Motta, We Who Feel Differently, was a multi-part project exploring the idea of sexual and gender difference after 4 decades of lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, intersex, queer, and questioning politics. As an exhibition, a series of events, and an opening symposium, the project sought to invigorate discussions around a queer we that looks beyond the tolerance or assimilation, towards a concept of equality that provides for greater personal freedom. The project drew upon the evolving database wewhofeeldifferently.info, which proposed, quote, difference as a profound mode of possibility for both solidarity and self-determination. This is the language that we used at the time, which I think is interesting to go back to now. The exhibition featured a video installation based on 50 interviews with an international and intergenerational group of LGBTQI academics, activists, artists, politicians, researchers, and radicals. Drawing upon early queer symbols and imagery, a series of new sculptures and prints situated narratives of the LGBTQIQQ movement in dialogue with developments in art and history, while also considering their critical significance in contemporary queer discourse and culture at large. The design of the space by Carlos and the architect Daniel Greenfield, featuring the multicolored carpeting that you're seeing, was an aesthetic and functional makeover that invited extended viewing and collective activity. Next slide. And actually, this is an image of the Thursday programs that we did throughout the project. And could I jump ahead to the next? I'm actually going to go back and forth. You could stay here for a second. We Who Feel Differently, a symposium, the opening symposium, addressed what it is what's at stake and what is made possible by embracing difference as a queer strategy within contemporary art, politics, and society. The 2-day symposium was conceived by Carlos and Reagan Trope as a scholar of performance studies and moderated by Anne Pellegrini, the director of the Center of Study for Gender and Sexuality at NYU. And can you go back to the last slide? Perhaps more importantly, or at least more urgently, during the run of the exhibition, Carlos invited local queer artists, activists, and academics to hold public events on select Thursday evenings. Events included a conversation about transgender issues in contemporary art, a lecture on queer and feminist theologies, a workshop on HIV/AIDS activism today, a cruising walk, a presentation of a book about queer responses to gay inclusion in the military, and a collective reading of queer texts, all of which address critical issues of contemporary queer culture in the United States. In my mind, Carlos's project, epitomized by his introduction, you can go to the next slide, of the opening symposium, was the culmination of my 5-year tenure as the Director of Education and Public Programs at the new museum, because the project as a whole, you know, activating the gallery space, this kind of discursive space of a theater, and going back with this program of addressing local concerns in the gallery space, kind of in real time with real bodies. That was an actualization of a reemergence of discursivity as a kind of value component to art and art making. I think that was super timely and informs us today. It's an integral part of how we maybe distinguish ourselves as practitioners in this field. And I wanted to invite Carlos into this conversation to talk about what this project, how this project and its manifestations, these different parts, are central to your practice.
Thank you, Eungie. Yeah, we feel differently, and especially the presentation and sort of like long residency that it was a part of at the New Museum, I think was really a breaking point for my career as an artist. It was by far the most visible institution I had a chance to show my work at. It was a place, you know, it was an opportunity to do our work really succinctly and expand the language, right? So sort of like the concerns that I was talking about before and how representation works, it was important to me that it would actually be put at work in using the space and also problematizing the space, drawing from the history of that space, right? Thinking of the New Museum as a museum that had presented the David Wojnarowicz retrospective that I saw in the late 90s when I first moved to New York, and that really changed the way that I thought, or the so many other projects that happened at the New Museum. I wanted to be, you know, in conversation with that. So I think the most important thing that happened with this project was thinking about the importance of the museum as a site for presentation, but also for creating context and also for subverting ideas about what a museum space is. And I think you were doing that already, right, with the kinds of projects that you were presenting there. But what became really apparent to me was how you could use an institution with such visibility as a megaphone to speak about things that maybe those institutions were not speaking about. And I think this is something that I've kind of like come back in circles to with the opportunity to show at different museums. It's the same strategy used at the Stedelijk Museum, for example, or in a project that I did in collaboration with the arts organization Electra and Stuart Comer when he was working at Tate Modern, was also using the centrality and visibility of an institution like Tate, the Stedelijk, or the New Museum to bring in some concerns about the representation of certain bodies, the exclusion of representations of certain bodies, and how bodies can in fact queer these spaces with different narratives. So I think that this project also started to push me to think about discursive engagement as not a parallel thing that you present with an exhibition, but as work. So the New Museum We Who Will Differently Symposium was the first of 10 symposia that I have done over the past 10 years. The last of which actually you were also involved with Rachel Nelson at SF MoMA and the University of California, Santa Cruz. So it was really a transformative moment. It allowed me to really frame the kind of artist I wanted to be, the kinds of forms I wanted to use, to understand the exhibition space, but also understand the discursive side as something that is related, should always be in conversation, and should be developed hand in hand.
Can we have the next slide, please? Let's use that chance to just describe a little bit about the last project that we did, and that'll lead us into Roya's presentation. Narrative Shifter, the Julio Salgado project, is part of this larger project, We Got Each Other's Backs, which is now at PICA. And the first iteration is seen here. Part of it is seen here. There's actually Julio's work being presented kind of on the full wall behind this vantage point. You can see the 3 additional channels on small monitors, and then the timeline. Again, a new version of the colored carpet, and here also painted walls to, I think, really upset the order of the museum and to amplify the colors and vibrancy in Julio's illustrative work. Next slide. And of course, he was the keynote speaker. So in addition to offering him this kind of platform for the contextual story of his life as an undocumented activist artist. Next slide. You also opened up the larger discussion that he is part of with Rachel. You organized a 2D symposium at Santa Cruz and SF MoMA that in this case was dealing with issues of sexuality. In other panels was dealing with incarceration in relation to undocumented issues. I think very importantly, the entire symposium was bringing in these different tangents together, bringing in different storylines, let's say, that emerge from a crisis brought on by our recent political, I guess, responding to the urgency of the crisis of our current political administration in the United States. And I was just hoping you could speak a little bit about this as we go into Roya's presentation, and maybe we'll look at the last slide of all the participants as you speak.
Yeah, so the symposium was called Bodies at the Borders, and it was looking specifically around issues of migration and the movement and displacement of peoples with a focus on sexuality and gender. So the idea was not only to think of geographic migration, but also to center the prison industrial complex as a site that creates borders, right? Or American Indian reservations as sites that are also borders, even if they're not necessarily demarcating specifically, but we all know socially, politically, and culturally, those borders are really strong and take place. So the idea was to bring this incredible group of activists and scholars in collaboration with Rachel to center the conversation around what it means to live in a society that is so demarcated by boundaries and limits and frontiers and spaces and walls, right? And it is, of course, I think, a work that is very much centered by the concerns of We Got Each Other's Back, which has to do with the experience of undocumented queer migrants in the United States. And the work that Eldai, Edna, and Julio have been doing to politically engaged openly and at great risk to create a culture of self-representation and of engagement with their communities. Hence the name, We Got Each Other's Back, right? There is sometimes these communities have no institutional support, but they most certainly have each other. So I think that is the kind of engagement we wanted to have. We wanted to create a contextual way of thinking about migration today and what it means to be undocumented through the work and the voice of my collaborators.
Great. Eungie, did you have any other follow-up questions, or shall we move forward?
Why don't you go ahead, and then we'll come back to other discussion of this in the context of what you present. Thank you.
Yeah, that sounds good. Okay. So I'm going to speak to the exhibition that builds on the iteration of We Got Each Other's Back that Eungie mentioned at SF MoMA, the first chapter around Julio Salgado called Narrative Shifter. And so I'll talk just a bit, give a little bit of context to the exhibition we have at PICA now, the first three chapters, full three chapters of We Got Each Other's Back. And then I have some sort of reflections and impressions I wanted to share around the exhibition and some of the things that come up that I think actually connect quite well to what Eungie and also Miguel and Hendrik have raised. And so we can have a little bit more collective dialogue and turn it over for audience questions at the end. So I'm going to read my presentation and then we'll go from there. And for the slideshow, please just feel free to loop through them manually at whatever reasonable pace. We don't need to, I'm not going to speak to specific images. So anything in that regard is fine. We Got Each Other's Back by Carlos Motta with Eungie de la Cruz, Julio Salgado, and Edna Vasquez is a 3-part multi-channel video installation featuring portraits of queer artists and activists in the US who are openly undocumented migrants actively producing work to denounce historic and present-day immigration policies. As mentioned, the first chapter with Julio was part of Soft Power as of MoMA that Eungie curated. And the second and third chapters feature Edna Vasquez and Eungie de la Cruz, who are both based here in Portland. It was produced in Portland this year in close collaboration with both of those subjects, and all 3 chapters are now on view at PICA through mid-February. We Got Each Other's Back seeks to visibilize and center individuals and identities that exist and persist at the borders and on the edges of democracies, politicized landscapes, and social geographies. For Carlos, it is a continued collaboration with openly undocumented queer artists in the US whose creative practices are indivisible from their activism in daily lives. The exhibition serves to reveal, engage, and challenge the complex and conflicting narratives of migration, parallel to the movements of bodies, sexualities, and genders deemed illegitimate or transgressive. The video portraits of Julio, Edna, and Eungie share their autobiographies, artistic sensibilities, and activist engagements through an ethos of participation, collaboration, and self-determination, which are things Carlos has been talking about throughout the conversation today. Subjectivity and agency are exercised in the crafting of one's own intersectional, nuanced narrative. As audiences, we receive these stories, perceive an openness and transparency, and yet in another sense, I think perhaps they're not for all of us. So here I sort of posed some questions to you, Carlos, in this, in a bit more of the presentation, and then, but really it's for everyone to think about, and I think relates to everything we've all been discussing this whole time. So as with many of your projects, We Got Each Other's Back redirects resources, visibility, and opportunity, informed by your consciousness of what is afforded you in the art world to a degree, space or platforms that you extend, share, or turn over in ways that strive for self-determination over singular authorship. In thinking about the exhibition's architecture and design, you've created literal platforms, almost akin to pedestals, for these stories to be shared that serve as hubs for a kind of hyper visibility. And I say that in thinking about the bright colors, the bold designs, somewhat dramatic lighting, these larger scale projections, stages with spotlights and microphones. As an audience member, we move from this concrete floor of the warehouse gallery onto the soft carpet of the plywood platforms. And I think about being at first confronted with the visuals, and then plug in our headphones and we become immersed in the voice. So we enter into a kind of world or chapter of Julio or Edna or Eungie. And in that feel a kind of tension between confrontation and immersion, or between being faced with something and inside of it. Similarly, the mural, which you've probably seen in the images at this point, which is called A Timeline of Undocumented Migration, The Dream Act, and DACA, stops us in our tracks as we enter the room. It's the first or second thing that we see and encounter. And it almost feels like too much information, too much work. We'll come back to it later. And if and when we do, the tiny lettering and the detailed chronology demand a time and labor not unlike the form and content of the piece itself. And it shifts from confronting us to drawing us in. I think of how that tension mimics the hard and soft politics or hard and soft angles of immigration, which are resisted by you and the other artists in the show. The viewers held inside the work while reminded that, as I kind of suggested before, these stories are not for most of us who are going to be viewing the exhibition. These narratives are neither captivating nor encapsulating. They cannot be consumed or packaged or exploited in the ways immigrant experiences so often are through lens-based media. There's no way to convert them to a teaching moment or a tool for any conventional advocacy or artistic authority. The openness and the outness, the queerness in and of the undocumentedness destabilizes or makes impossible the formulaic and the mainstream. In turn, the power dynamics you interrogate are not just thematic, but formal and functional. The institution is implicated, and everyone I think has spoken to the way that you think about institutions in your practice. So we, the institution, must shift our own conformist relationships to art world conventions, decouple from its contexts and its conveniences, and construct alternative economies of labor and money. We have to do more paperwork. We have to document differently. We have to administer anew. Yours is not a reactive, knee-jerk social practice. It's not a codified institutional critique with a capital IC. So this brings me to my prompt. And I think we can really open it up from here. As a curator of public engagement, I think a lot about this. Who is this project or similar ones that you've made for? And who is it not for? And I'm thinking of you. I'm thinking of the collaborators, Eldai and Julio and Edna. I'm thinking of the institution, PICA or any other. I'm thinking of the curators, the visitors to an exhibition, participants in other ways, and the preparators and installers, in this case, who were hired through a local workers center. And perhaps a better phrasing is, how is it for you or for someone differently than it is for me or for someone else? And I'll leave it at that.
Should I answer that, or we want to? Okay. It's
yeah,
I mean, it's
for you or anyone.
That's a really difficult question. I wish that Eldai, Julio, and Edna were here to speak with me about this, because I feel, especially Eldai, in the context of this exhibition at PICA's role is really a co-maker. Eldai designed, wrote, performed, is really the maker of his chapter. So it's hard for me to speak for them, but I will speak in general from the perspective of having worked in these projects before. I think the idea with this work is, again, using complicated. It's the idea with this kind of project is, as I was saying earlier, using the institution as a bridge for inclusions and exclusions. So certain bodies and certain groups are feel naturally enticed to go to a museum. Some others never do. Maybe there is a problem of institutional outreach. Some people are never invited to come to a museum. Some people are invited to come to a museum. I feel that by making work about specific subjects, there is a relationship already that is open. Also working with you, Roya, or you, Eungie, in creating a set of public programs that is actively seeking the certain visitors to come and engage and create with their bodies a space of sociability in relationship to a specific issue, is one of the central issues of audience. So to me, the work is really about those communities that are being spoken about, represented, and engaged with. Right. So at the new museum, I think the really nice thing about this Thursday event, Thursday events, the symposium, and the other things that happened there, is that somehow the new museum really became a kind of gay and lesbian and trans center for the summer. And people were cruising, relationships happened, people met up, and the new museum has historically been a pretty queer museum anyway. But the idea that there was a museum in town that was conducive to meeting someone that you were going to get laid with later was fun. I thought that. So in that sense, the audience was that group. But then there is the interface of whoever else is coming to the museum, the tourists, the art people who come to the museum who may or may not be interested in this practice, and those interactions. So at the new museum, for example, I witnessed a really interesting interaction between a pretty radical trans activist and a Polish couple that were scandalized what they were hearing in one of the monitors. And so to see this moment of kind of like impromptu pedagogy happen, where this trans activist was trying to convince this Polish couple on their position and the other way around, made me think that the work was working. The work was creating a set of relationships that become social interactions that transcend the work itself. So in that sense, I feel like the work has always been done. This line of projects, right, the more socially engaged kind of projects, has been done with the communities that it speaks about in mind first as its main audience. And from then, the relationships that happen naturally because of the different constituencies that are taking place in an institution like that.
Is anyone? I'm thinking about what others have brought up around relationship to institution and what Carlos's work sort of demands of us as workers within those institutions. If we have any thoughts about that.
Many thoughts, but I'm going to ask a question first, if that's okay, because I was so struck by what Eungie was saying and what you were just saying, like two let's say a project that started with we, we who feel and we have each other's back. And I'm just curious, like in 7-8 years between the two we's, let's say, has the we like shifted for you, and if so, in what ways, and how do you sort of like relate to that word now? Because it's such a wonderful word in relationship to your work, but I'm also curious what the shifts may have been.
Yeah, I mean, it's also a really complicated and fraught word, right? I mean, the idea of pretending to be a collectivity when identities are so fragmented and it's almost an impossible project. But in the case of We Who Feel Differently, it was very specific because the genesis of that project is around the politics of equality that were so prominently featuring in the United States and elsewhere around that time, 2010, 2013. And it was this idea that the LGBT subject is sort of like just like you, right? It was presented by mainstream activist groups, and the fights that were specifically chosen to be fought, marriage equality, inclusion in the military, demanded a certain kind of assimilationist narrative under the umbrella of this we. We are respectable human beings. We should be tolerated. We should be invited to be part of your party. We should eat from the same table. We're not going to be scary. Our sex is not going to make you run away. When in reality, I think then one of the nice things is we want our sex to make you run away. We don't want to eat from the same party. We want our own space. So the we there is really what is playing off of or ripping off of this construct of collectivity around mainstream activism and bringing it back to perhaps a construct from earlier on in the years of the sexual and gender liberation movement, which was a radical we that resisted institutions, marriage, the military, imperialism, and so on and so forth. Yeah, so I feel in that sense that we was sort of like very specifically chosen and articulated. And as I was saying, the most recent we, and we got each other's back, it was actually, the title emerged from one of Julio's videos, where he's actually speaking about this, how sometimes he feels that there is, if everything else is collapsing, at least they got each other's backs. So it was really, to speak about that, what it means to be a collective that is kind of left adrift without any support. But you have affect and you have friendship and you have networks of collectivity that keep you going.
I want to ask you more about, oh, sorry, Roya, were you going to say?
No, it's okay. I was just going to say, we also have a question from the audience. So maybe Eungie, and then we take the final question from the audience. Does that sound good?
I just wanted to follow up on this idea of the radical we as it relates back maybe to Miguel's presentation as well, because I think when I say that your introduction to that symposium was a kind of a culmination, it was that radical we that you were citing. You really very directly and very blatantly kind of condemned gay marriage as an approach to equality or freedom. And I was very moved by that. And I wanted to ask today how we identify a radical position in relation to all the compromises of this moment.
That's a huge question. I mean, it's so complicated to think about, especially during the years of the Trump administration. There was a certain kind of looming cloud, right? Like a certain kind of darkness that reflected the seeming failure of forms of activism and articulation from the left. Like what is left if not to come out and protest, and all of those forms that we have been using for so long, they felt to be suppressed by power in ways that left us unable to speak in many instances. And that of course shifted and changed so strongly this year with Black Lives Matter and in previous years with undocumented activism and so on. So I feel that I'm losing the train of thought, Eungie, but I feel like the question of well, and we are also trapped in this narrative in the United States right now with the Biden presidency, right? Because there is, and you're seeing it in the kind of split that is happening already amongst Democrats, from the more progressive Democrats and the more centrist ones, which is like, okay, now you're in power, now we can AOC saying now we're in business, we can now go back to what are the real concerns from the left. So it feels like it has been a really kind of tiresome and looming moment for activism, where these forms of radical thought and action have been suppressed, and we need new forms to articulate them right now, hopefully under a less repressive form of government.
Can I ask one last thing?
Yeah. Go for it.
Very quickly. Yes, because I was thinking that we are talking a lot about speeches, dialogical processes, and contextual conversations that are the basis of what you call, Carlos, this ethical artistic practice. And I wanted to ask you about your relationship with language, writing, and poetry, because you write a lot. I mean, you are a writer. And I wanted to, and I thought, I was remembering that I actually ended my essay for the book with a fragment of a really beautiful text. I would say, I would call it a poem actually, that you brought for a publication entitled Radical Anticipation that I made with Seoul Museum of Art as part of the SEMA Biennale in South Korea in 2016. Actually, thanks to Eungie, who was part of the advisory team of that. And I wanted to read it. It's very short, but I wanted to, to talk with you about this. And well, I'm going to read. Queerness is anger as pulse, is politics as endurance, is language as freedom, is a radical anticipation of a future that is both hopeful and transformative, is hard as shield, is fate in our dreams.
Thank you, Miguel. By the way, I forgot was there a question?
Yes, so your relationship with poetry, writing, yeah.
Right. I used to write much more than I do now. I have to say that I have been disengaged from that, except for the text for the films that I've made in the last years, which I also write. And I think I'm constantly drawing from poetic phrasing as a form of speaking about reconciliatory efforts towards justice for the characters that are there. There is a question, I mean, the question of language to me is also interesting because I have made everything and using English, which is a second language. So there has always been this question of translation and distance that has been really interesting for me to think about in the work, what it means to speak from a language that is not my own, a set of phrases that I have also always thought about in relationship to the forms of my work, as a way of bridging, aesthetics and speech as forms of articulation. And So that I think has given me a certain kind of critical distance from myself and my own ideas, because I always have to think about everything twice. I articulate it in English, and then I sort of like have to think about this again in Spanish and go back to it and write it or make it happen. That was a really disjointed answer, Miguel. I'm sorry, but that's all I can do for now.
We're getting close to time, so I thought maybe we could pose this question from the audience. Yeah. Okay. So this is a bit of a departure from what we're talking about right now, Carlos. But an audience member, Emilio Rojas, asks, "What are the specific strategies that you had to unlearn when returning to your early photographic work, and the process of this early practice that you are hoping to remember?"
Thank you, Emilio, for your question. There was a lot. I mean, as I talked about when I was speaking about this, I had to learn again how to not over-intellectualize and conceptualize everything, but actually to remember to make work from my stomach and not my head so much. Not that there was anything wrong with that other approach, but I think the challenge really became trying to bridge both ways of working, trying to be more intuitive and more impulsive and reactive, and sort of like occupying a space of interaction with my own ideas that didn't necessarily come from a very structured plan to follow. So it was really about breaking away from that path that for a few years I thought was the only way. I thought art needed to be made this way, it had to be engaged in politics in a certain way, it needed to look in a certain way in a space. And I feel that that was a moment where I allowed myself some freedom, sort of like to shake off that skin and let off that luggage behind and continue a new path. And hopefully that will happen again at some point, because I feel like every artist gets comfortable with certain tropes, I think, and it can only continue to be exciting if you are constantly questioning yourself and questioning also the different things that would overdetermine a practice, the influence of the market, or your relationship with galleries, what it means to sell, concerns about institutional relations, what it means to show in a museum of a certain size as opposed to an art center that is smaller. I feel artists who forget to self-question get kind of stuck in old patterns and ways. And I hope I don't get stuck in those patterns and ways. I want to keep fresh as much as possible. And I'm already sounding like an old person speaking, of course. But yeah, thank you.
There's one more audience question. Do we want to take time for that and then wrap up?
Sure.
How does that feel? Yeah. Okay. Let's see, how do I want to phrase this? This is someone who's seen the exhibition at PICA. How do you come to your color, design, or editing decisions? Does it emerge as you're working with your collaborators, or do you see these things as a key part of your own practice or style?
Thank you for that question. Yes. So, for example, Elday de la Cruz's project is actually structured in relationship to his interest in the colors black, brown, and white. The videos, which are things that Elday was talking about. So the videos happen in a black set, in a brown set, and in a white set. So for the display presentation of this work, it only made sense to echo those colors because they were the colors that had structured Elday's presentation. In relationship to Julio's colors, for example, that are used in the presentation, they were inspired by Julio's work. Julio's work is very graphic. using text over solid colors, and they're often pink and this kind of bright colors. And with Edna, there wasn't really a conversation with Edna about color, but it made sense to present because that stage is a stage where Edna has also performed. So the red was the kind of color of cabaret in a sense, and also a color that Edna has worn before. So I was going through some of Edna's photographs and videos, and she likes that color. So that it also became, it got determined by that. In the case of We Who Feel Differently, for example, it was obviously speaking about the rainbow flag and sort of like ripping it apart somewhat. So the colors were determined that way as well. Some other times it's really just an aesthetic choice. Like for example, in the presentation at SF MoMA of the same work, the colors yellow and green, Eungie chose, remember? Because they were, I was going more for the pinks and the purples, and Eungie suggested in a really good move that we needed some colors to break that and make it more dynamic.
Okay, thank you. Any final questions or words from the panelists or from Carlos? But
just a huge thanks really for this opportunity. And
yeah, thank you all so much.
It's really heavy. The book is really, really heavy.
As it should be.
So it can be used for a weight also, but it's really fantastic. And I want to congratulate you and thank you for your work all these years. I think the work itself brings us together, has brought us together on other occasions, and we thank you for that a lot.
Thank you all so much. This was really meant a lot to me. It means the world to be with you, and for everyone who joined us in the conversation as well. Thank you so much.
yes, thank you all so much. Thank you, Carlos. And for those of you in Portland, the exhibition is up through February 14th. And the books are on sale online, on Skira, on PICA, a lot of places. So, okay.
All right.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Congratulations.
Bye.
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 Yeah. Congratulations.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
And we're clear.
Okay. I was wondering, are people still like, okay. Roya was like, bye. Good.
Did you feel okay? Thank you all for your questions and your presentations.
It's great.
Amazing. Brilliant. I love the conversation. Really nice.
Yeah,
That's good.
thank you so much. It was long.
It was long.
It got really dark here.
It felt just right from the audience perspective.
Oh, good.
Yeah, I felt totally engaged the whole time. And
Okay.
Roya and I were having a back and forth. It was good. I think it was flowing quite nicely. So
There's
you
so
for-
much to say. I mean, like 22 years of work, you know, it's kind of incredible. And the long, I mean, I really enjoyed those moments when we were looking at the long arc of things in your work, you know, those are the most like, those are also the moments that the book actually kind of brings like together, of course, in a meaningful way. So I had a great time. Thank you all.